Hello, my name's Douglas Guilfoyle. I'm an Associate Professor of International Law and Security at UNSW Canberra at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to speak with you about submarine cables and cybersecurity. So the first question is, what are submarine data cables and why are they important for Australia's cybersecurity? Well, you'll still find people who think that the majority of internet traffic and international communication moves via satellites, but that's actually less than 5%. Our connectivity to the internet outside of Australia is entirely reliant, in effect, on submarine data cables. They're important for all nations' cybersecurity. So, for example, in a famous 2008 incident in the Mediterranean, two separate submarine cables were cut. This reduced the internet connectivity of Egypt to the world by 70% and India by 60%. Now think about the knock-on consequences for business with so many services outsourced to India. Also, it went beyond that. Certain unmanned drone flights in, for example, the Iraq theatre that were going to be conducted by the US couldn't be for a period of days or indeed weeks because the operators were sitting in the United States and were unable to communicate with those drones. And what were to be unmanned flights had to be conducted by manned crews. So the functionality of these cables has significant business and national security implications. So what specific threats does Australia face in that context? Well, as this map illustrates, there are a limited number of landing points on the Australian continent that link us to the world. And one of the things that we simply don't know, particularly in the commercial sector, is how much of our data or how much of our services in the era of software as a service, where you might interface with a back-end application only through a web browser or an app, how much of that actual infrastructure is held offshore? Where's our data? Where is our processing happening? Where are the things that are required for us to run our businesses effectively managed? Now, much of it may be onshore, but some of it won't be. And also, if all of those cables were cut simultaneously, we would be, for example, effectively cut out of the international financial transaction clearing system, which is heavily reliant on, for example, New York and London. So, what role do submarine cables play in warfare, and how might submarine cables be utilised in warfare? Well, there are a number of points to be made here, but one is that every major global conflict has opened with some of the actors involved cutting cables. So it was the first thing the United Kingdom did before entering both the First and Second World War, was to cut German means of communications with the outside world. So we can imagine that one of the first things you might do in a global conflict is seek to isolate your adversary's communication systems. But also in cyber conflict, the submarine cables themselves are likely to be a vector for incoming attacks, and particularly the idea that's been mooted in Australia of the risk we might face of a cyber Pearl Harbor, a devastating, overwhelming first strike attack in the event of there being an international conflict, which is designed to take out your opponent in a single blow by impairing or rendering useless critical infrastructure. And we'll come back to that risk later. So this leads to a number of ethical and legal issues, which I can only sketch very briefly here. But one of the great difficulties we have then is that, in essence, submarine cables constitute part of a broader network of critical civilian infrastructure that's capable of cyber disruption. Now, in the event of an open armed conflict, taking out these capabilities could represent a decisive military advantage and might ordinarily be thought lawful, subject to a balancing act, the principle of proportionality, which has to be where you have to weigh military advantage against the damage done to the civilian population and civilian objects. But that law came about in the time of kinetic attacks, the actual physical destruction of, for example, buildings. It's not obvious that, for example, using submarine cables to launch a cyber attack that would wipe out health records, social security and tax records, other kind of critical data sets that are necessary to running a society, would actually constitute damage or even be regarded as an attack by the law of armed conflict and war as we know it under the UN Charter system. And my picture on this slide is of the United Nations Security Council. So how do we manage those ethical and legal issues in this new age? Some of the questions that people in my field are looking at is, can we reinterpret the existing law without making new law to apply to these new realities? Or do we need new guiding principles where we might declare certain civilian infrastructure completely off limits under all circumstances? We're all potentially affected by the vulnerabilities of submarine cables and systems that are reliant on them at basically two levels. One, anytime we rely upon a service that is hosted offshore, our access to that service is dependent really on just a handful of cables that could be disrupted not just off the coast of Australia but almost anywhere. And indeed, you would only need to disrupt, say, 3 or 4 submarine cables total to more or less take, for example, the entire country of India offline. So there's a lot we rely on in the background of our lives where we're not necessarily sure where it's housed or what redundancies there would be. Also, when we come to our scenario, we'll see that as a national society, we could all be affected by the possibility of, say, a cyberstorm, cyber blitzkrieg, or cyber Pearl Harbor event. So I've been talking a lot about cybersecurity and cyber warfare and the role that international law and the rules of warfare might play in this space. And so one of the questions here is the way that submarine cables disrupt our assumptions about territory. So for a long time there was a theory that international law and security norms didn't apply to cyberspace, that we'd have to come up with something new from scratch. It was a totally new domain, so we needed totally new law. It's now generally been accepted that the principles of international law as we understand them already apply equally to cyberspace. And one of the fundamental principles around this was that, well, actually, cyberspace doesn't exist in the ether. It exists in actual physical infrastructure. And if the infrastructure is physical, it's located somewhere, which means it's in a state's territory. So we can apply norms like cross-border uses of force or sovereignty to this infrastructure to protect it, or to at least know, who can protect it and who can control it. But the problem with submarine cables is they're essentially privately owned infrastructure, most of which is laid outside national jurisdiction beyond the territorial sea. Normally, in the case of such objects, we have a system of international protection. So ships on the high seas are responsible to and protected by a flag state. Space objects in orbit similarly have a state of registration. There's no such system for submarine cables. At best, there's the 1884 Paris Convention on submarine cables that was designed only really to deal with the age of wireless telegraphy. So we lack a sophisticated system for protecting and understanding submarine cables in terms of international law and security norms. So a question I was asked to consider for this presentation was, how is Australia responding to the threats and vulnerabilities of submarine cables? What is being emphasised in the discussion? What is being missed or glossed over? And at the moment, I'd say that pretty much the entire field is being missed or glossed over. We're not really paying attention to, as it were, what lies beneath the waves. There are some nuances to this. So Australia has supported the laying of submarine cables between Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands as part of a security plan, in the sense that we wanted to do it to prevent China moving into that space. So we've seen that there is a strategic dimension to cables, but there's not really a sophisticated discussion at present around the role that submarine cables play in our national security. Stepping back from my immediate field, I've been asked, what's the most interesting thing I've discovered or learnt about cybersecurity and cybercrime in Australia? And I'd have to say, the thing that's really struck me in recent months has been the extent of our vulnerability to ransomware and the extent of our exposure in the business sector to the risk of ransomware, of being locked out of one's systems until one pays a ransom in cryptocurrency to international criminals. And the problem is, of course, we've got a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that are large enough to be attractive targets to such criminals, but too small to really want to invest heavily in their own security against such high-impact, low-probability events. So I think in that context, something that Australia's cybersecurity professionals need to be thinking about is the response to ransomware, and also a couple of national security issues I'll come to in my scenario. So we need to be a lot smarter about, for example, reporting requirements. If you have a ransomware incident, should you be obliged to report it and convey any analysis you might have conducted to the government so that there's some kind of knowledge base around these things? And those are things we're going to have to confront as to how we answer this as a whole of nation enterprise. One of the difficulties we face in this space is working out how to get the kind of balance right here between business and the general community looking after themselves and there being a role for government. And certainly part of the national Australian cybersecurity strategy update is to look at how we should protect critical infrastructure. But there is going to have to be a kind of whole of nation effort to improve the cybersecurity at the enterprise level and indeed the individual cybersecurity literacy of the general population. One of the things that I do think is potentially missing in our current approach to cybercrime and cyber threats is a sort of joined up piece of thinking around the disinformation threat to our democracy in general and the potential for cyber means to be used as an attack on democratic systems. In Australia, traditionally, we've still relied very heavily on a very rigorous and actually hard to hack system of counting paper ballots. Whether in the age of pandemics we'll be able to continue with that is an open question. We do have strong foreign interference laws that target foreign acts that have a coercive, corrupting or covert element. The key distinction then between legitimate influence or public diplomacy operations and interference being particularly that element of being covert, of being undeclared. Nonetheless, how those laws will operate in practice is really yet to be explored. I think the Australian approach to cybercrime and cyber threats has traditionally followed very strongly a US-led approach of a decentralized model where originally the government stood back. Now we've obviously seen with the expanded role of the Australian Centre for Cybersecurity and the Australian Signals Directorate more of a central government response than perhaps we saw in the past. But we haven't yet kind of reached the American level of having enterprise level cybersecurity health checks, for example, being offered by government departments. So the scenario I would like you to consider is what we might call a cyber Pearl Harbor, a cyber storm, or cyber blitzkrieg. That is, at the opening of an international conflict, there's an effort to incapacitate Australia in one immediate cyber blow. So the thought here is, imagine a massive malware or ransomware attack, such as NotPetya. Imagine something like Russian efforts to shut down the Ukrainian power grid. Imagine the massive DDoS attack in 2007 that paralyzed the Estonian government. Imagine the kind of disruption caused, for example, by the 2020 bushfires on the New South Wales coast that took out electronic banking, the systems that help produce clean drinking water, the ability of people to procure food or petrol. Now imagine all of those happening at the same time because of a multi-wave, multi-vector, sustained series of cyber attacks using perhaps a spectrum of techniques and a number of zero-day exploits all at one time. Now, how would we as a nation recover in the face of such a sustained campaign? Is it worth investing in cybersecurity sufficiently strong that we would actually be able to defend against such an attack? We know that defense is very hard in cyber. Do we need to be thinking more carefully about how we set up our critical systems so that they fail slowly and gracefully? And what efforts are we making for national resilience, including perhaps tabletop exercises for CEOs and senior government department ministers? Faced with that cyberstorm or cyber blitzkrieg scenario, what would be your policy prescriptions for Australia? In any event, I hope this has been an interesting and engaging introduction to an area of research that's very important to me and an aspect of our cybersecurity that I don't think gets enough attention. Thanks for listening.